In this post, we're going to look at a different set of challenges posed by authoritarian populism. In particular, we're going to focus on 5 challenge areas that we identified in the context of massively parallel peace building. These include communication-related problems, fact-finding related problems, challenges associated with collaborative governance, and a range of economic issues associated with making the invisible hand really work. If you want more background on this series on massively parallel peace building and our analysis of the authoritarian populism problem, it's all available from the website and the web page for this particular video. So yet another set of issues to address if we're going to try to think about, again, strategies for constructively dealing with this whole cluster of conflicts that's dividing so many societies so deeply. The strategies for promoting more accurate communication and more mutual understanding and seeing ourselves as others see us and seeing others as they really are, not this characterization that we've imagined that to make them even more evil and us more virtuous. And there are a couple of ways to come at this. The idea that I like most is based on Karen Armstrong's Charter for Compassion. And she documents, I think, pretty persuasively that all the major religious disciplines in the world have as one of their core beliefs some variation on the golden rule. That which is hurtful to you, do not do to others. This is something I call principled compassion. You could call it altruistic in some way. Obviously, this is something that is well worth cultivating, but in deeply divided societies, that may be a step too far. So I talk about something else, which I call pragmatic compassion. And this is a sort of scaled down version, and the principle is pretty simple. You don't want to make people any madder at you than you absolutely have to. Now, it seems like good, simple tactics. So what that implies is building a mirror. We talk about a conflict mirror. And what you want to do is, it's not a literal mirror, but it's a way of thinking about yourself and looking at yourself as others see you. And if you find that if you look at yourself, put yourself in somebody else's shoes and look at yourself and find that you're doing things that are ugly, and you want to change that. And that, I think, is something that, again, small groups of people could come together and help people understand how things that they're doing that they think are perfectly reasonable are actually really antagonizing their opponents in a really unnecessary way. A couple of examples of how you might apply this principle. One is just the general idea of balancing complaints with compliments. One of the things that I've noticed, and I find it disagreeable when it's addressed toward my group, and I'm sure other people in other groups find it disagreeable when it's addressed towards them, is folks on both sides of the political divide have absolutely nothing nice to say about the other side. Just this constant stream of complaints about how they're the source of all evil and everything that has ever gone wrong in our society, and especially anything that's going wrong now, is their fault. And it's not surprising that people tend to turn off when faced with that kind of litany. And it's a whole lot smarter to say, there are some of these things that, at least to me, and here I versus you messages make sense, there's a post on that, are problematic in these ways. And I think it would be wise to change. But on the same token, there are these things that I think we agree on and we could work together in areas of common ground. If you try to, again, the simple idea, balance complaints with compliments, I think the level of opposition that you run into will be a whole lot less. Not only does it diffuse the conflict, it tends to strengthen your ability to protect your interests. Another idea is something that you might call a flip the wording exercise. Now, one of the things, the wise things that we did following the tragedy of 9/11 is, as a society, at least in the United States, and I think there was strong support for this on both the left and the right, recognize that you don't want to blame all Muslims for the actions of a few terrorists. So a headline in a picture like this on the left, Muslim Americans are the biggest terror threat to the United States, would have been considered, no, that's not good. Now, the truth is, in the current escalated rhetoric, we get too much of that sort of thing. But in the era following 9/11, we were wise enough to avoid that. But you can substitute just one word, and you have a picture, instead of somebody who's looks like a Muslim terrorist, have somebody who looks like a white terrorist, and you have a headline, white Americans are the biggest terror threat in the United States. It's not white Americans, it's a very small group of folks who are, in some cases, engaged in criminal activity. And you want the wording to focus specifically on that. So another way to look at this is you want to focus on individual, not group responsibility. If bad things happen, there are criminal perpetrators that are, at least if the law enforcement community is successful, are held accountable for their actions. And there may be folks that incite violence and illegal activity. They should be held accountable. But the larger group to which they belong shouldn't be tarred with the reputations of a few criminal elements. And so you want to reach out to the larger group, try to persuade them that, we don't think you're the same as these extremists. And if you can do that, that will go a long way towards diffusing things. Right now, I think we've tended to ascribe to whole groups the characteristics of just a few extremists. And that's part of why we're in such a deep hole. Another challenge in this massively parallel peace-building series is how one obtains and effectively uses real facts. And in this era of debates over fake facts and all of that, this is especially important. And there are some interesting projects here that one might want to highlight in one way or another. The MediaBiasChart.com folks have actually a fairly rigorous methodology for placing various news sources on this bell curve diagram. And you can go to their website and get the details. But at the bottom ends, you find extreme groups on the left and the right that tend to traffic in information that's unreliable or outright fabricated. But near the top of the curve, and especially on both shoulders, you've got relatively reliable information that presents ideas from different perspectives. So one of the things that a community group could do is to try to highlight this kind of thoughtful, unbiased, but still looking at arguments from both sides, sets of information. One of the keys to dealing with the fact-finding challenge is to recognize the limitations of what we know and how our worldview is determined by the bubble in which we live. And when we look outside the bubble, we need to resist the temptation to look at the other in hostile and disrespectful ways. Now, this is an interesting map that has the results of the 2016 election. The darker the red, the more Republican or conservative. The darker the blue, the more Democratic or progressive. And there's some other sort of lighter colors that are kind of in the middle. And you can see that we live in geographically separated enclaves. with most of the progressives on the coasts and in a few liberal communities scattered around the country and in Native American reservations along in the southwestern U.S. The other thing that I think, this is an interesting observation and metaphor that I think goes to a very critical idea. Especially on the progressive side, we tend to spend our lives flying from one progressive enclave to another around the country. And as we fly over the Republican parts of the country, flyover country it's called, there's a tendency to look down on them in a disrespectful, condescending way. And there's probably a reverse version of this on the conservative side. But I think it's important to have respect for communities that are very different, and don't sort of assume just because they're different than the other, they're all bad, and don't ascribe to these entire communities the most negative traits that you've heard about in our highly escalated rhetoric, where people are trying to push hate bait and intensify partisan enthusiasm. And the last point to make in this context is the very, very critical role that respect plays in determining the course of conflict. One of our colleagues has been instrumental in carrying the Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies program now for several decades, and they've been very successful in observing and helping people understand that humiliation, treating people with disrespect, is one of the huge drivers of conflict. So what we need in this context are community groups that urge us all to think about the other in respectful ways and to discourage disrespect and to give folks the benefit of the doubt. Another set of ideas, again, these are massively parallel peace-building challenges, have to do with working together collaboratively. And in this climate, that's kind of hard to see how that's going to happen. But again, you could bring together small groups of people on the left and the right to try to work out collaborative ways of addressing common problems, and then publicize their results, their agreements, so everybody knows, at least, in addition to the us versus them animosity, there's an alternative of actually working together. And one model that you might want to pursue for this is this is an exercise I used to do with my students. You take a contentious issue and you try to get students to sit down around a table and identify, okay, for folks on both sides of this, what points of agreement exist? What can you agree on? Okay, now where do we disagree? And then, when you disagree, which of these disagreements are attributable to different images of facts that we could conceivably work together to answer and then maybe diffuse those agreements? And what disagreements are attributable to values? We have different priorities, and those are tougher. Then you can talk about what possible compromises might come out of that, ways of advancing mutual interest, and then strategies for more constructively addressing those areas in which you do have value-based disagreements. And this is the constructive confrontation idea. And I think bringing together folks to do something like this for a wide range of contentious issues, again, is a way of demonstrating that we don't have to just stay stuck in this fight it out mode that we've got ourselves caught in now. Now, if we're going to be able to get folks on both sides of the political divide to agree to work together collaboratively to address common problems, we have to be able to do things like resist the free rider syndrome. That is, if there are sacrifices to be made, costs to be paid, we need to do that equitably, and everybody needs to participate. In this sort of silly little diagram, you've got a bunch of folks working to pull this rather heavy weight up a hill, and another bunch of folks that are just sort of standing around and enjoying the advantages of getting the weight pulled up the hill and not really doing anything. That sort of thing breeds the kind of resentment that makes collaboration impossible. And we need to apply this principle to all of the big problems that we face. Take climate change as an example. And here I might be being a little bit unfair, but I don't think so. I think that there is a tendency on the part of the progressive left, especially the elite progressive, relatively wealthy left, to be very enthusiastic about fighting climate change and insistent that we scale back sharply the use of fossil fuels, scale back sharply the use of giant pickup trucks and that sort of thing. And what these measures do is they impose huge costs on conservative communities, especially those whose economy is based on oil and gas production and exploration, those whose recreation is based on public lands and in a place where mass transit really isn't an option and big vehicles are. But at the same token, folks on the left I haven't heard much in the way of calls to reduce air travel. And people can be very concerned but think nothing of jetting across the country for a weekend, for a wedding or a go ski vacation or something. They also tend to get really nice subsidies for putting solar collectors on their houses or buying a Prius and that sort of thing. So the truth, especially if you're relatively wealthy, is the sacrifices that you're being called upon to make are pretty modest compared to what you're asking of folks, especially in the rural energy-dependent West. And I think your ability to pull folks together would increase fairly dramatically if you were to lead with the sacrifices, the painful sacrifices that you're prepared to make. And maybe some, to tax you, folks who are relatively wealthy should tax themselves some to alleviate the impact on communities that are dependent on oil and gas. So this is just one example, but I think a big part of why we have trouble collaborating and what we need are citizen groups that call upon us all to make equitable sacrifices, and especially for those who are wealthier, to have them make a bigger sacrifice, because the truth is they can afford it. And this again probably cuts both ways. Another area in which there's a need for working together is in promoting good governance in one way or another. And we all ought to be able to agree that it's important to fight corruption. And I think, if you sort of filter out all the misinformation and rhetoric and you get down to the core issues, I think you would get a lot of agreement on this. And here are a couple of articles with some relatively stunning findings that the greatest rate of return on the planet is lobby. And if you can spend a modest amount of money to get favorable government rules or contracts, you can get very, very rich. So finding ways to get people to cooperate is again a way of finding ways to work together and getting beyond this us versus them confrontation that we're stuck with. Another thing to challenge is when one side or the other does something that sort of makes it impossible for the two sides to work together to compromise. One example here is the recent budget deal, which is running gigantic deficits in times of economic prosperity, not in times where you need government spending to recover from a recession, is over time going to dramatically worsen the federal government's balance sheet and choke off spending for things we could do together to advance the common good. And challenging that's important, I think. Yet another idea is we need a common agreed upon history, certainly of the ongoing and recent political crises and some of the scandals that are lurking around. I'm thinking back on the Watergate era where there really were bipartisan investigations, and I think the history of what happened then is pretty clear. We need something like that now. Whether it happens remains to be seen. But in the current climate, it isn't going to just be focusing on one actor like President Nixon, who did something that was pretty much indefensible. But I think we need to acknowledge that there were mistakes made on all sides and be truthful about those mistakes. This goes back to the truth and reconciliation stuff I was talking about. But that can give us a common history that we can build upon. Otherwise, we're going to have both sides having a self-serving history that will reinforce conflict over the longer term. And finally, the last one of the challenges in our massively parallel peace building list, and just one aspect of this, but it's a very big one, is promoting the invisible hand, making that our market economy work. A big part of the energy underlying populist movements on both the left and the right is the failure of the economy, even in today's booming economic times with relatively low unemployment rates, to deliver rewarding employment opportunities that pay a livable wage to anybody who wants to work. And this problem is projected, for lots of good reasons, to get worse in the years ahead, in part because of artificial intelligence and the automation of a staggering number of jobs, and in part because of globalization and a global workforce which imports what Marx called the reserve army of the unemployed, driving down wages. And what's also concerning is that not very many people seem to be taking the problem seriously. There's some sort of, Democrats talk about modest job programs and things, but I don't think anybody's really coming to grips with the severity of the employment crisis that we're likely to face over the next decade or two. And I'm trying to think about what kind of, again, small citizen effort one might be able to mount to do a better job of addressing this. And I hit upon the example of the X Prizes, and there's an X Prize Foundation, and what they try to do is they put up cash rewards, and they try to encourage people to focus attention on neglected problems. Now, some of these are very serious kinds of things, making clean water available to folks, transforming, basically pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and using it for useful products of one sort or another. Some of it's a little bit wacky. But I got to wondering, could we encourage a lot more people to try to grapple with this coming employment challenge with something that I'm calling the Omega Prize, and get somebody to put up a lot of money? It's not so much the money, it's the publicity, and to try to get lots of people, especially young people, to devote their energies and their careers to addressing the problem. At any rate, for the Omega Prize, I'd suggest the question like this: how can we, despite artificial intelligence and globalization and immigration and the concentration of wealth, which is also a big part of the problem, create a true full employment economy that offers a livable wage, rewarding work, and social respect for all? Now, if we can do that, and if we can mobilize that sort of energy, I think we'll be in a lot better position. Something my students used to sort of talk about, what could they do to make a difference? And there's this search for what's going to be the next big iPhone. I think the next innovation that will really change people's lives, and might make you a lot of money as well, is figuring out how to answer this question. In the next post, we're going to explore steps that the super rich and the meritocratic elite might be persuaded to take to help promote social equity and to address a lot of the underlying energy behind the authoritarian populism challenge.